choice. It's very nice to see you all. My name is Ewan McGaughey, School of Law, and this is the fourth lecture and discussion in the series that we're doing on current issues in Labour's economic policy. We're going to be covering corporate governance, banking, and net zero, or at least that's how I advertise it, but actually thinking about the way that the government's pledges have worked. What we should perhaps be calling it now is not net zero, but the goal of now zero fossil fuels. And we'll get into exactly why that's so important in just a few slides. These are the pledges that have come from leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, when he was running for office. He said that we should increase income tax for the top 5% of earners, reverse the Tories' cuts in corporation tax, and actually the Conservatives did that themselves after Truss, and clamp down on tax avoidance, particularly of large corporations. No stepping back, said Starmer, from our core principles. We should set a national goal for well-being to make health as important as gross domestic product, GDP. Put the Green New Deal, which of course is the sort of big spending package being proposed originally by some British academics and then got big in America, but put the Green New Deal to fight the climate crisis at the heart of everything we do, because there's no more important issue more important to our future than the climate emergency, and we need to demand international action on climate rights. So those were from pledges 1, 2, and 3. And of course, as we know, things sort of get changed, it gets repackaged as we go into the election, and this was from Labour's manifesto. Firstly, in relation to banking, Labour also wants to keep mortgage rates as low as possible with a strong and independent Bank of England, which will continue to target stable inflation of 2%. In another part of the manifesto, page 57, we have this, and this is really where it gets interesting. The Conservatives' decision to prevent the Bank of England giving due consideration to climate change in its mandates will be reversed. Labour will make the UK the green finance capital of the world, mandating UK regulated financial institutions, including banks, asset managers, pension funds and insurers, and of course those last three is what we covered last week, and FTSE 100 companies, so our big listed companies, to develop and implement credible transition plans that align with the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. These are all put together pledges that concern us, particularly that last one is useful to set us against what's happening in EU law, because pretty much the same thing has just passed through the European legislatures. The European Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive 2024, which says, if you put Articles 2 and 22 together, that companies or corporate groups with over 1,000 staff and over 450 million euros in annual revenue, I'm simplifying a little bit, but big companies, must have a business model and strategy compatible with the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees in line with the Paris Agreement, including exposure of the company to coal, oil, and gas-related activities. So these are all the pledges, what's going on in the EU, it's what Labour has pledged, but the key question for us is how that can actually be put into effect. We all know that there's a climate emergency. We all know that it's caused by fossil fuels, coal and oil and gas, even if it hasn't been admitted in legislation, international treaties till quite recently. But what is it that we should actually change in the architecture of the city and in the UK in order to reach these goals? Just to repackage and summarize those pledges again, and this is the order that we'll go through today. First of all, you've got this idea that all big financial institutions and companies have to have a credible 1.5 degree plan. Second, we've got related to companies, this idea that there should be fairer taxation in our system, particularly on companies. And thirdly, we've got in Starmer's pledges, particularly this idea that we should be looking beyond gross domestic product as our main national goal. We should also look at well-being and, of course, low mortgages, and the Bank of England plays a central role in setting monetary policy. So those are the pledges, and like with all the other lectures, what we'll do now through the rest of the time is go through human rights, like why it matters from a human rights perspective, the legal background in the UK today, where we rank internationally in the data that we've got, different models for reform, and finally the costs and benefits of carrying out reform. Okay, so starting with human rights, why does it matter? Why does all this matter from a human rights perspective? Well, pretty similar to last week, we've got these two key rights in the Universal Declaration and the European Convention. Everyone has the right to work, just and favourable remuneration. What on earth does that have to do with banking, you might ask? Well, a great deal, because in setting monetary policy, it affects overall interest rates and inflation, and it has a knock-on effect on wages and employment. And of course, fiscal policy, what the Treasury does, has exactly the same kind of impact. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the well-being of himself and his family, or indeed her family or their family. And that, of course, is important to what banking regulation is doing, because in affecting the overall levels of prices and employment, banks have a major impact on this central human right. And then secondly, everyone has the right to life. And just like last week, as we saw last week, this really matters for the city, it really matters for banking, because the European Court of Human Rights, in the Klima-Signorinen and Switzerland case, has said that the right to life in Article 2 and related in Article 8 has to be interpreted as putting a positive duty on member states to reduce emissions under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. To quote the court again, the state's primary duty is to adopt and effectively apply in practice regulations and measures capable of mitigating this existing and potentially irreversible future effects of climate change. And just if you're wondering, the claimants in this case were a group of old Swiss ladies who were interested in the climate. So that's Klima-Signorinen. So they got together, they sort of formed a union or an association, the Verein, and they brought an action against Switzerland, their government, for failing to cut emissions quickly enough. One of the claimants died during the litigation. Their claim was that climate damage was having a negative impact on their health, particularly through things like heat waves. And they won. And also slightly relevant for today, it wasn't any individual, the court said, who could bring the claim. It was the group, an association. So to have standing under the European Convention on Human Rights to go to court to sue, the court says, well, we're not just going to let anyone do it. You've got to be an association. And they won. And the other thing, I suppose, that's relevant is that the court spends a lot of time in the judgment talking about how badly Switzerland had failed to deal with their claim. It wasn't taken seriously in the courts, the evidence was ignored, and this happened right the way up through the appeals process. But the European Court of Human Rights says, well, it's a positive obligation on the state to do something about climate change, and that includes every institution within the state. That includes the government, and it also includes our courts. You don't need reminding, but I'm going to remind you anyway, that carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions are completely through the roof. So for most of human history, you've breathed in about 0.28% carbon dioxide with every breath that you take from the air. But that percentage of carbon dioxide in the air that we breathe, because of the burning of fossil fuels, has risen to 0.0419%. I actually updated these every year, and I'm afraid that I got this wrong. So that was last year. That was this year. You've got 424 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we know that the more carbon dioxide that there is, the more methane, other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It acts like a blanket, so when the sun's heat comes in, it gets trapped, and that's why the planet is warming. Very bad news, considering that our pledges are about a 1.5 degree limit. I hate to break it to everyone, we've already reached 1.5 degrees of global warming. That was earlier this year. The House of Lords Library document there on the left asks in January 2024, the 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming limit threshold, could it be breached in 2024? And the answer pretty soon after that was, yes, it certainly could. There's an article from the BBC, second one in February, not more than a few weeks later, saying that we had indeed had one whole year of temperatures at 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels. The United Nations is warning that this goal will soon be dead without rapid emission cuts, and the UN is saying also that without greater action than the path that we are currently on, really significant action, the planet's going to warm by 3.1 degrees. So, what that means, I will put it to everyone here, and I'm interested, really interested to know what all of you think. I will put it to you that that means that if we have a credible 1.5 degree plan, as the government has proposed and the European Union is requiring, that means that we actually have to end coal and oil and gas, not by 2050, not net zero by 2050, but really now. Every single drop of oil, every lump of coal, every puff of gas is causing further climate damage, and therefore will heat the planet more than the 1.5 degree goal. Okay, so now on to the legal background. How does corporate governance work in the UK? In a rapid summary, go into taxation a bit, private banks and their regulation, and the Bank of England's goals. To start with companies in the FTSE 100. Some of this is related to last week, but it bears repeating and can't be repeated enough. In most big companies, the people who run the companies, the directors on the board, appoint themselves. There's usually a nominations committee if you've got a listed company, and there are rules about independent directors having to be a majority of the nominations committee, but most companies are self-perpetuating bodies. Directors appoint their future successors. This is what you get from the model articles. It can be changed, but that is the practice almost ubiquitously. Directors can be removed, however, by the general meeting of a company. So second basic organ, board of directors, and then the general meeting is mainly full of shareholders. And as we saw last week, most shareholders, the ones who hold the voting rights, are asset managers. Big asset managers like BlackRock, Legal & General, State Street, Schroders. Shareholders can, if they get together in the general meeting, remove directors under English law with a simple majority vote of 50%. But that is very rare in practice. The asset managers that control all the shareholder voting rights generally side with management on almost everything. Asset managers who hold the shares and hold these votes aren't investing their own money, they're investing other people's money. So that money mostly comes from people like you saving for retirement. If you've got a pension already, if you don't have a pension, get one as soon as you can. It's a very good idea. You won't have to worry about it later. It's a very good idea to have a pension, but that money goes into big funds that usually get invested in the stock market. Your pension trust or your pension fund will usually delegate management of your money to asset managers that do the investment choices and also take on the role of casting shareholder votes in company general meetings on questions like who should be on the board, what kind of policies should companies have. Where is the democracy in all of this, you might ask? Well, there's a little bit at the pension fund end. Pension trustees have to be at least 1/3 elected by the beneficiaries. This can be raised to a half by order of a minister. But the majority is usually appointed by employers. When pension funds delegate votes and shares to asset managers just sort of take on the role of voting. And even where pension funds have grouped together to tell the asset managers how they want to vote, asset managers in the UK are currently ignoring them. And for those of you who were here last week, Janice Turner, head of the Association of Nominated Trustees, had a campaign to try and get all the asset managers to follow their environmental, social and governance policies. She represented about £1 trillion of UK retirement capital. But currently the asset managers aren't doing anything, and there's no regulation yet. That's all sort of set out in the Howard report. Very few companies in the UK have worker-elected directors. That is the norm around the OECD and most EU countries. Generally, 1/3 to 1/2 of a board of directors will be worker-elected. The only thing that we've got in the UK is a comply-or-explain rule under the UK Corporate Governance Code that says that companies have to consider, but don't have to follow, one of 3 different worker engagement options. One of these is sort of politely suggesting they might put a worker on the board, but almost no companies actually do this. Unlike the situation in Germany, where just under a half of the supervisory board is worker elected, or Sweden, where it's about a third, or Denmark, where it's roughly the same. So the UK is sort of below international standards in that respect. Directors have a whole series of duties under the Companies Act. They've got to follow the rules in the Constitution, they've got to act for proper purposes, they've got to have no possibility of a conflict of interest. But for our purposes today, there's a couple of duties that matter, particularly. One is Section 171, Section 172, that says that directors have to act, broadly speaking, to promote the success of the company for the benefit of members, and have to pay regard to a list of stakeholders. And these stakeholders include, the environment and employees and supply chain. You've got to consider the long term. But this is a subjective duty. It's subjectively framed, very hard to find that there's been a breach, and only 1 or 2 cases on it. Nobody's ever been successfully sued under that section. Usually what happens is that directors use it as a defense. I've got discretion to pay regard to all these different stakeholders, and it's a subjective duty, so very hard to sue and show it's been broken. The other duty of care that's relevant is, the other duty that is relevant is the duty of care. So directors have to not be negligent, they have to exercise care and skill in the way that they carry out their job. A whole bunch of case law on what this actually means. A relevant case for us is called Medforth and Blake, actually about insolvency and the duty of care in insolvency. But it said that an insolvency practitioner running the company, like a director, shouldn't be wasting assets or shouldn't be wasting money. If there's a very easy way to save money, they've got to exercise a minimum level of diligence. That case was about getting pig food discounts for a farming business. Okay, so directors have got these duties, sort of marginally related to the environment, but duties also have to be enforced, and they rarely are. So we have something called a derivative claim procedure under the Companies Act that says if you're a member of a company, you can go to court and you can claim in front of the court that a director has breached their duty, and the court will let you if you show that you've been acting in good faith, and broadly speaking, it's for the benefit of the company. There are much more restrictive rules if you're not a member of a company. So for instance, if you're the beneficiary of a pension fund, and your money has gone into a company, but it's gone through a sort of chain of investments, then you've got to follow a very different procedure, which is buried in the volumes of common law and equity. As I found out with my colleague Neil in the Court of Appeal last year, we tried to bring a claim against the university superannuation scheme to reverse the cuts to pensions. Turned out that we kind of won out of court because they did after we started suing them, and also to divest fossil fuels. And the Court of Appeal told us we didn't have standing under the company law procedure. We had to go through what we were sort of proud to set a precedent in this respect. They called a beneficiary derivative claim. And there's just different rules, and basically the sort of big hurdle that the Court of Appeal said that we had was that you had to have some way to ask all the other beneficiaries what they thought about the validity of the claim, something that we could have very easily done, but we hadn't done by then. So we left it settled there. That's a summary, a very basic summary of the state of corporate governance. And the relevance for the climate crisis is that there's just not that much there that helps. On the contrary, this is the structure that has existed more or less for a long time that has given us the state of the climate that we are currently in. Now, tax. Slightly different topic, but useful to go into since the budget was just yesterday. We know from the first couple of lectures about national insurance. So just to repeat, companies that misclassify staff as self-employed, like Deliveroo, cyclists, or Uber drivers, can benefit by not paying national insurance contributions. It was, or it is, 13.8% national insurance contributions if you've got an employee, nothing if you're self-employed. As of the budget, it's going to go up to 15%. And taxes on labour are generally higher across the board in the UK than taxes on capital. So if you've got a job and you're an employee, you pay sort of basic rate of tax 20% if you earn over £12,500, 40% over 50,000, 45% over 125,000, and so on, plus national insurance. If your income is coming through dividends, so you're not working at all, you're just investing and you're benefiting from your capital, then the basic rate, or the low rate, is 8.75%, not 20%, 33.75%, not 40%, 39.35%, not 45%. So lower taxes on capital. And then you've also got capital gains. So if you sell your shares and you've got a gain, then you get taxed at different rates again. And one of the things that's just been addressed in the budget is that private equity managers who take over companies, perhaps make them private from being a listed company, and earn lots of money from it, their income is taxed as if it's a capital gain under what's known as the carried interest rules. And that's at 28% instead of what could be a much higher figure of 45%. And what Rachel Reeves, the Treasurer, said yesterday is that that's going to go up to 30%, 32% initially, and then be harmonized with the income tax rules. Finally, we've got corporation tax. Corporations, unlike people, real people, are taxed not on their revenue, or not what their income is, but on their profits. And the small companies rate is 19%. The main tax rate for corporations is 25%. We are the lowest in the G7 countries. So if you have a look at the sort of long trends of taxation in the UK, we can see pretty clearly that taxes have gone down quite a lot. So this chart shows taxes on capital and labour, corporation tax, income tax, national insurance, then also value-added tax in the yellow line. And broadly speaking, taxes on the top earners and on capital have gone down very significantly. The taxes that affect people who work the most, namely national insurance, which is only paid up to about £50,000 at 8%, has been going up and up and up and up. And VAT, value-added tax, which is, of course, the tax on the goods and services that you buy, has crept up very significantly, gone up very significantly from about 10 to 20% over the years. How are private banks regulated? So private banks, firstly, have to get licensed by the Prudential Regulation Authority, set up under the Financial Services and Markets Act. They all have to have a license, and with that, they have to follow the rules that the regulators set. So the key idea of licensing is, we give you a license, you follow the rules, and the license can be taken away if you don't follow the rules. Private banks are almost all constituted in exactly the same way as any other company. So they've got governance rules that are the same as any other big company under the Companies Act. They have self-selecting boards. Shareholders exercise residual control. these shareholders are mostly asset managers, and the asset managers, by and large, follow their own agenda, or they follow what management of company, or they don't question what management wants very often. Private banks, I think it's also worth pointing out, are very heavily subsidized, not by the government sort of physically giving them cash. It's not like that, but the subsidies that they get are systemic and very, very large. First of all, banks have an insolvency guarantee. They can't be left to go insolvent, something that was sort of generally assumed before the financial crisis, when banks did in fact get bailed out. But we actually put it on a statutory basis in the UK under the Banking Act 2009. So banks are different in that respect. If you invest in a bank, you know that the solvency of the bank is going to ultimately be underwritten by the government. More importantly, if you're a customer of the bank, the solvency of the bank, well, actually doesn't matter, because all your deposits are guaranteed up to £85,000 in the UK. Banks also do very well out of monetary policy. So in open market operations conducted by the Bank of England, that's where they buy loads and loads and loads of securities traded by banks at different prices in order to inject more money into the system, or credit into the system. Banks do very well out of this. They make large sums of money. And they also benefit, unlike us, from the base rate that the Bank of England sets. So private banks get an account with the Bank of England. They can borrow at the base rate, unlike you and I. We have to go and open an account at one of the private banks. We can't open an account with the Bank of England. And of course, the private banks set an interest rate usually significantly above the Bank of England base rate in order to make a profit. And there's really no regulation on private banks so far as the financing of gas, oil, and coal go in the law. We've just got sort of vague duties, and there's nothing in common law and equity that requires divestment of fossil fuels, or at least our case lost in the Court of Appeal. We were told to try another procedure, so there's nothing there yet. Fourthly, how is the Bank of England itself regulated, and what goals does it have? So the Bank of England is a public bank. It was nationalised in the 1946 Bank of England Act. It was originally a private bank, but over the years, from its foundation in the 1600s, it became more and more regulated because basically in the early stages it outcompeted all the other private banks, and it became the banker to the other banks because it had more capital. Capital concentrated. The Bank of England became dominant. Because it was systemically important, there was an increasing amount of regulation on it, until it finally just became a nationalised public entity, as, by the way, almost every central bank around the world is. So the Bank of England's Court of Directors, Board of Directors, but they call it Court, is appointed by the Prime Minister. And you might have all heard of the fabled Bank of England's independence, set up by Gordon Brown, much heralded in 1998. What this really comes down to is that they can't be removed very easily. So you and I have a right to claim if we are unfairly dismissed in a tribunal. Statute goes further for the Bank of England Court of Directors. It said that they can only be removed for very limited reasons, which include things like gross misconduct and bankruptcy. So that is the Bank of England's sort of main governance structure. There's no duty in making an appointment to the Bank of England board on the Prime Minister to appoint any particular stakeholder group. So there's no duty to appoint representatives from unions or labour, different regions around the UK, or people who are particularly expert on the environment. This is different to what we find in many other countries, notably the Federal Reserve in the United States. When making appointments, the President has to consider representation from the different parts of the country, industry, commerce, labour. The main goal of the Bank of England in its operations is set in statute in section 11 of the Act. and that's price stability. Now, this is not interpreted, it's not defined in the Act. It gets interpreted by the Treasury. So the Treasury can say to the Bank of England on a regular periodic basis, if it wants to, that this is what we take price stability to mean. And of course, what you and I will ordinarily think of as price stability is correct meaning. It's like, the price of goods and services, a basket of goods mainly set in the consumer price index. Subject to this sort of first goal of price stability, the Bank of England is also meant to use its monetary policy powers to achieve growth and employment, or the government's plans for growth and employment. Different, again, worth noting, to other central banks, like the Federal Reserve, again, which is actually, funnily enough, quite a progressive model, which says that there's no sort of number one goal. The Federal Reserve is meant to pursue its policies for maximum employment and stable prices and moderate long-term interest rates altogether. It doesn't sort of place inflation above employment, crucially. Now, growth, if the Bank of England has to follow the government's plans for growth and employment, and of course that's one of Labour's big pledges, to have growth. It's our number one goal from the Labour Manifesto. Growth is usually defined in terms of growing gross domestic product. So this is very important, and it has no definition in UK law. It includes economic activities of all kinds. Gross domestic product could include things that are good. So, I sell you a mobile phone as an exchange of goods. It adds to GDP. You look at company accounts. You look at all the things that companies are doing, the profits that they're making, the wages that people are earning. You add it all up, you get a GDP figure. But it can also include things that do active harm to us, like pollution or harm to health and well-being. We don't define it in law, but it's worth noting that the European Union does have a regulation in 2019 saying how you calculate GDP. What we've got is just the practice of the Treasury and the Office for National Statistics. So this is a quote from a Treasury document in 2017. It says that GDP is calculated in three ways, adding up all the money spent on goods and services minus the value of imports plus exports. That's the expenditure method. Second one, the money earned through wages and profits. Like I said a moment ago, that's called the income method. And the value of goods and services produced. All three different methods, says the Treasury, in calculating GDP should, in theory, give the same number. And it does this on a sort of regular quarterly, I think it's quarterly basis. And it does it through a survey, not accessing everything, but through survey and estimates. And the Treasury, in this 2017 document, says GDP matters because it shows how healthy the economy is. But I'd put it to you, and I mean, actually, I think there's there's an increasing consensus within the economics profession and more generally that GDP does anything but show how healthy the economy is. GDP includes things that actively harm the economy's health. If we take the economy to mean, as I think that we should, the people in it and the organizations in it. It can include profits from harm to human health, for instance, British American Tobacco with its headquarters down the road earning lots of profits. It's all going to get added to our GDP figures. If you have BP and Shell making lots of money from polluting the environment, or Thames Water spilling sewage, its profits go into GDP, even if it's an actively harmful activity, as long as there's profit from it. Welfare can be damaged and GDP goes up. So we spend per capita quite a low sum of money on our health system. America spends a very high amount of money on its healthcare system. We have a mostly publicly owned health system. America has an almost entirely privately owned system. They spend about 3 times as much as we do on healthcare. And so if we put our NHS into the private sector, we privatized it more, and suddenly we were paying for lots of things instead of having it free at the point of use, this would add to GDP statistics, even though we could actually be getting poorer with worse healthcare outcomes. Same thing with schools. If suddenly all the private schools are privatized, GDP will go up because now you've got a transaction which is measured in the GDP statistics, whereas before it wasn't. Tuition fees in universities put GDP up as opposed to if it was free. So, these are some of the problems with GDP. It doesn't include everything. So since the early days of these calculations, it was decided that GDP measurements would exclude unlawful activity of certain kinds, like selling drugs, like marijuana or cocaine, but it doesn't exclude other things that are unlawful. If it's not an illegal drug trade, it could still be unlawful for a company to pollute sewage, but the profits that they get pollute with sewage, but the profits that they get will go into the GDP statistics. Okay, and all this matters for us if we're lawyers, because there's no legal definition of GDP at the moment in the UK. So where do we sit internationally, and what does the data tell us about, well, I particularly want to focus on the climate. First, our deceptively low statistics on emissions, or our share of global emissions, and secondly, the UK banking sector's financing of fossil fuels. So this is the good news. This chart shows UK emissions up to 2022, and we can see that in the different categories, which, by the way, we're going to be going through in the next few weeks, the particularly amount of emissions from our electricity supply has gone down pretty dramatically. And that's because we've finally closed almost all the coal-fired power stations. We've got gas stations left still. But most of our energy now is coming, if you look day to day, it's coming from wind and it's coming from renewables. So the electricity supply has been decarbonized. We haven't done very well yet on domestic transport. So transport emissions have fallen a little bit, but pretty much stayed the same. Of course, that dip there right at the end is COVID, when we couldn't go anywhere. So domestic transport emissions are sort of basically flat. That might be changing now if we had statistics right up to 2024. We're seeing more electric cars and buses. Agriculture is pretty flat. Industry has been going down, but that's not necessarily because we're doing better with our own industry. It might just mean that our industry is closing and moving to other countries where industry is still just as polluting. Construction industry, buildings and products and their uses also come down a bit. That's things like gas heating. So domestically, it looks like there's problems, big problems, but we are getting there. But because we're looking at banking and the FTSE 100 today, the picture becomes much, much different if we start looking at our companies, because they have global operations, not just in the UK. If we take the top 3 fossil fuel producers or polluters in the FTSE 100, BP, Shell, and Glencore, and you look at their global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions around the world, it comes to about 13 times the entire UK's greenhouse gas emissions. So BP produces 2,429 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent each year. That's 632% of the UK's total emissions, which from memory is about 380 megatons of CO2 equivalent a year. Shell is 430% of the UK's total emissions. Glencore, which basically does coal, 90% of its emissions are from coal, is 282%. So there's the UK's greenhouse gas emissions, and there are our companies, BP, Shell, and Glencore. And the international treaties from the UN framework on climate change allow us to do this, because what we're supposed to do is reduce our domestic emissions. But I think that in reality, if we just limit ourselves to doing that, then we are missing the most significant and damaging activity that is needed to change to stop the climate crisis. Then we've got the banks. Now, we don't have, or at least I couldn't find before this lecture, a sort of nice clean figure about how much we get from the banks in greenhouse gas emissions, but we certainly know how much the banks are giving to fossil fuel projects. So if you look at the FTSE 100, top 5 banks that you find in there are Barclays, HSBC, Standard Chartered, NatWest, and Lloyds. Just out of interest, hands up if you've got a bank account with one of these banks. Okay, there we go. Hands up if you don't. Okay, well, just a few. So that's most people, right? So the vast majority of us will be with one of the big 5 or 6. And if you add up all of the new fossil fuel financing that they've given since the Paris Agreement, since the global treaty to try and finally end climate change, they've given over $500 billion to new fossil fuel projects, new oil, new gas, new coal. The Banking on Climate Chaos report in 24 finds that if you look at the 60 largest banks globally, they have given $6.8 trillion to new fossil fuel projects. And so this is something that very simply is more important to regulate if we want to stop the climate crisis than our own domestic emissions. It's 13 times more important to regulate BP, Shell, and Glencore, and it's more important in an unknown quantity, but over $500 billion to regulate these 5 banks. And it's worth saying that if we, this is to illustrate the sort of illusion that national accounting for greenhouse gas emissions gives us, if we were to include the greenhouse gas emissions of BP, Shell, and Glencore, we would move from 22nd place in greenhouse gas emissions worldwide to 3rd place. We'd be emitting more than India with the immense amount of coal power that India is burning through, largely because our companies, our global companies, have operations in countries like India that are giving their energy and profiting from the continuation of fossil fuel-based energy. Oh, not sure why that came up again. Okay, so now we get to the models and options that we've got to meet the goals. What options would the Labour government have? Would indeed every single EU member state have to comply with the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement? We'll go through the same list: companies, tax, private banks, and Bank of England. Okay, so firstly, in corporate governance and regulating the FTSE 100, it's worth repeating from the past couple of weeks, that one part of the solution is to look at changes to corporate governance, things like having more elected members in pension funds from the beneficiaries. We know that people, real human beings, have preferences that are very different to what pension fund directors and asset managers are doing. There's a big divergence between your preferences, if we take a poll of everyone here and everyone across the UK, on what is needed for climate action and what asset managers are doing. So one thing that could be done is improving democratic accountability, as we talked about last week, and the same goes for more worker directors on boards, as we find across most of the OECD countries. But what about directors' duties? Well, actually, there's a private members' bill right now going through Parliament, just been introduced by a Liberal Democrat member of Parliament called Martin Wrigley, and he has proposed something that he's naming the Company Directors' Duties Bill, which says in the very short summary, we don't have the text yet, that it wants to reform Section 172 so that directors have a duty to employees and to the environment. However, I think it's worth pointing out, if we're using Section 172 as a model, much debated, one of the most debated directors' duties, it's very likely that it isn't going to achieve that much, because there actually was a duty in the Companies Act 1985 to require that directors acted in the interests of shareholders and employees. There was never any litigation under this duty. There was never any case law. Didn't do very much. And also across the United States, most states have what they call constituency statutes. The directors don't just need to pay regard to different stakeholders and, like we do, sort of give slight priority to members, but the directors have to balance all stakeholder interests. These were introduced in the hostile takeover bid wave in the 1980s. But really it operates as a defense for directors. It doesn't actually promote sort of good pro-stakeholder behavior, if that's what you're interested in, from directors. It just doesn't do very much. So a different option, different model, would be to amend different parts of the Companies Act. Either Section 171, which focuses on the powers that directors have and constrains their discretion, or the duty of care in Section 174. And here's just two suggestions, really just related to what regulation is trying to do everywhere else, but you can put it into the Companies Act. So one option would be to say that there's just a duty on directors to switch their energy supply, to get electric vehicles, to decarbonize the gas heating in their buildings, and to switch, particularly where it's cheaper to do so. And I think that bit is important. I mean, you don't have to have that. You can just say, well, no matter how much it costs, you should switch. But one of the problems that we've got with companies is that it would actually be rational for many of them, for instance, to switch to electric vehicles in their fleet. Over the medium to long term, it would save them money because clean energy, clean fuel is already cheaper than fossil fuels. But as human beings, we don't make rational decisions all the time. We have a status quo bias, and companies often are just the same. Another option is just that you could require that directors comply with the 1.5-degree target, cease coal and oil and gas investments, cease all investments if you're a bank in coal and oil and gas, as fast as technology allows. But the other important point is that whatever duty you have, it should be enforceable. You've got to make sure that it's not just a duty that only the existing groups can sue on, because we know that asset managers in particular don't sue very often at all. You've got to open up derivative claims to representative groups. So like in the Klimas Injurinen case, where the European Court of Human Rights says, well, you can't sue if you're any old individual, but you can sue if you're a representative association. You could have similar thresholds in the derivative claim procedure, so that you could give a group of beneficiaries the right to claim, a representative environmental group, or a union. And of course, all this would do is enforce the rules that directors have, but it would take away the incentive to break the rules because they're never going to be sanctioned for it. I'll go very quickly through tax, see what's in the budget. Things have started to change. There is a gradual move to tax capital more than labour. Adam Smith's principle was that the more you earn, the more you should pay. This was his equality principle. There's nothing in the budget about raising taxes on dividends to the same as employment income, which is a little bit strange. All the focus has been on raising capital gains tax rates, particularly on private equity. But then on private banks, how you might regulate them, very simply, there's already powers to do this. So right now, the Prudential Regulation Authority could say, as part of your license conditions, banks have to stop financing new fossil fuel projects, or you have the withdrawal of the license. This is not a dramatic step anymore. So we saw last week that the biggest Dutch pension fund, ABP, has divested from all fossil fuels. If you're a bank, the equivalent would be not financing any new projects, but also decarbonizing your portfolio. And there's actually a good model that's been written in America called the Fossil Free Finance Act, introduced by Ed Markey in the Senate, which says that all new fossil fuel projects have to cease within 60 days of the act being passed. Oh my word, it's going to be the election next week. We'll see if they have any change in the composition of the legislature. Hopefully not for the, no, anyway, not going to think about it. The bill is there. It gives us a model, and we could do something very similar in UK law, even without primary legislation. What about the Bank of England? Well, the first thing is that you could just simply define price stability in law. If you do that, you can make the Bank of England pay regard to all of the things that Starmer and the Manifesto were talking about in their pledges. Pay regard when you're determining what is necessary for price stability to house prices. So the CPI measurement of inflation excludes a number of different housing costs. And if that is the case, then escalating rents, escalating mortgage repayments, escalating house prices are not really being considered as a priority by the Bank of England. And that's not price stability. You know, the price that you pay for housing is important. Pay inequality, differential changes in wages, people who are wealthier earning more and more and more while everyone else's pay stagnates is not really stability either. And when you have volatility from fossil fuel prices, particularly we saw that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, then that is having a serious impact on price stability. But none of these things are set down in law and actively being considered by the Bank of England. As we saw at the start, the Conservative government, ex-Conservative government, actively told the Bank of England to stop considering climate. And now it will again, but you could set it down in law. Second thing is GDP calculations could be set in law that the bank and the Treasury use. And you could simply add a section in the Bank of England Act that excludes from GDP calculations polluting activity, such as fossil fuels that are funded by banks or profits from fossil fuel companies. And another thing that you could do is you could discount, and you know that some calculations might have to go into this, but you could discount activity that is harmful to human health. So Starmer's pledge is, well, we should make well-being as important as GDP. You could have a discount factor of, I don't know, 50% for junk food, or 100% for tobacco. And you know, the model for why we should do this is actually the guy who came up with GDP calculations in the first place, Simon Kuznets, who devised the method of accounting for GDP in the New Deal in America in the 1930s, said that the welfare of a nation, he said, well, here's how you can calculate everything that America does, and did a lot of work on that. But then he said, the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income as he had just defined for us. Indeed, he said it was dangerous to use this, and it would simplify a complex situation. So very, very simply, what we could do is complexify the simplistic definition of GDP to discount harmful activity. New Zealand has been experimenting with a new definition of well-being in its national policy, and we could look at them for models. Finally, the benefits and costs of reform. So the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry, did a report just recently that suggested economic gains from going to net zero by 2030 would be pretty tremendous. Every year, we would get 44 billion more in economic benefits from electric vehicles, 112 billion from clean power, 19.1 billion, this is every year, from clean heating, and 78 billion when you add up other sources of economic activity which are decarbonised. 250 billion every year in economic benefits if we move to net zero. Now, they don't exactly tell us how they arrive at these figures, but it does seem like a lot. And I think that, you know, that is one of the best sort of estimates that we have to hand of the kind of benefits from driving the economy and doing so at a macro level through banking and the FTSE to net zero. If we look at what different tax changes would lead to in benefits, taking away private equity's tax break was calculated by the Centre for Taxation to yield 1 billion a year. The measures in the budget are predicted in stages to phase out private equity's tax break to result in a bit less, 140 million. Of course, all of these figures are estimates. HMRC gives us some estimates for different tax changes for how much you could raise in revenue or what the costs would be. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell us how much changes to dividend taxation would yield for us. And finally, on changing the central banking and banking system to rework the goals, to pursue environmental goals, it's been estimated in a new paper in Nature from an institute in Potsdam in Germany that by 2050, there will be a $38 trillion cost to the global economy, 90% off the global economy if we do nothing. And so avoiding that cost would seem to be quite a good idea. The same paper says that it will cost us $6 trillion to have the policies that comply with a 2-degree warming limit. But I actually think that it's very speculative, all these enormous numbers, very hard to know what is right. I actually think that the benefits could be much, much more, simply because of this chart on the right-hand side. This shows the cost of electricity from different sources of energy. And what you can see in the big orange line is that the price of solar energy has declined below every single form of fossil fuel energy. Onshore wind has too, so even cheaper than gas. And so very simply, the economics of doing nothing, the economics make doing nothing a very, very costly proposition indeed. Instead of it costing us $6 trillion, the normal changes in the economy, if all geared towards net zero or now zero, can yield very substantial benefits. Okay, so these are the questions for discussion in summary. What are the reforms that we want to do to get to a situation where corporations in the FTSE 100 comply with the 1.5-degree goal? What are the long-term desirable changes to taxation if we are interested in taxing the top 5% of earners or capital? How should banks be regulated, and what reforms to the Bank of England and GDP are desirable to protect well-being and solve the climate crisis? So that concludes the first part, and I'd like to invite now Dr. Pedro Schilling to come up on stage, and we can kick off the discussion for everyone. So Pedro, the stairs are just around here, and yep, warm welcome from UCL. Pedro is an expert in both financial regulation and environmental law, so a very nice combination. And you work in the law school at UCL, and I must say, got a great new paper out in your quarterly review coming out soon.
Thank you. First, thank you very much for the invitation. Really delighted to be here discussing things pretty close to my research agenda and to my policy contributions as well. Maybe before starting with more questions, I think one of the grips we have in finance quite often is the machines are rebelling. Yeah. When we're dealing with finance, I think one of the things that's pretty hard to grasp is just the outright size of the numbers we're talking about. So maybe to also put in perspective the numbers we just discussed, the IMF, for instance, puts annual subsidies to fossil fuels at $7 trillion per year. So it all sounds like unattainable amounts, but they are being channeled through different parts of the system as well. I might probably start with the first question, which is very close to the paper, which will be coming out soon. When it comes to corporate governance, I think especially in the UK, we have had many years of discussions, as you've mentioned, on reforming Section 172, on corporate purpose, and on changing the shareholder primacy approach. So looking at the shareholders as the metric of success of a corporation, to more stakeholder approaches. And we haven't really, I think, gone very far necessarily with those. I come from a country that has the social purpose of a company. There's other countries that are more stakeholder oriented. And we end up with very similar issues in terms of enforcement. Great paper by Harvard's Marina Bergendler, for instance, showing that it's not really a magic bullet saying that you have to take those into account if you don't say how you have to deal with trade-offs in instances where interests between different groups of stakeholders might not be aligned. So for corporate governance, especially in the UK, I would single out two things. One, giving substance to directors' duties, which I think is pretty close to what you're discussing here, although I focus more on what regulation makes to the content of directors' duties, and making enforcement work, aside from private enforcement, public enforcement as well. In relation to the first point, I agree section 171, 174 are very good entry points, and I think even the most orthodox of company lawyers will tell you that directors' duties are plans. They're flexible, right? Their actual content changes as expectations change. And even if we look at, again, very conservative decisions in company law, Klein Earth versus Shell is an interesting case that could have gone wrong for a number of reasons, and probably went wrong for the worst of all of those reasons. It mentions that directors have to choose something in a range of reasonable decisions. I think one thing in the UK and other jurisdictions as well that courts are grappling with is what are those ranges of reasonable decisions in matters that might be very technical, very sort of heavy on the science as well. And the Klein Earth case, you can really see the courts not willing to engage with analyzing the contents of Shell's transition plan. Here, I think regulation can help because if we look at pieces like the taxonomy, which is sort of saying what are sustainable activities in a variety of sectors, if we look at something like the CSDDD, which is establishing sort of greater obligations in relation to sustainability, or if nothing else, narrowing that range of reasonable decisions that is available to director. We're sort of saying not only you have to produce a transition plan if the transition plan doesn't have X, Y, Z, or if it's saying that carbon capture is going to save the day, that's not going to discharge your duty as well. So I think regulation has been advancing not as quickly as it should, but it has been advancing more quickly than regulation usually advances, and that interaction with directors' duties can be, I think, quite helpful. But that's all well and good, but continues to be a problem if we don't have enforcement, right? So great, we have greater expectations, we have more content to how we're actually going to deliver things like transition plans. If directors and corporates are not held to account, changes very little. Here, I absolutely agree that we have a very broken system of derivative claims. That's more stringent than basically any other jurisdiction in the planet. Making that work better, and I think, again, regulation giving substance helps with that process a little bit, is a first step. But equally, regulation especially opens the door to public enforcement. So great, all companies have to do transition plans. If nobody's really supervising the content of those transition plans, if nobody's really seeing if they're actually complying with the regulation in the first place, matters very little. We have the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, starting to bring the first greenwashing cases, which is a nice development. Even the previous government was talking about creating a new public entity with a mandate for enforcement in the areas of security legislation called ARGA. And we are seeing, even in the private realm of litigation, some interesting advances in other pieces that are a little bit less restrictive probably than derivative claims, like Section 90 of FESMA, that are starting to bring broader kinds of claims as well, that if you marry that with advances in regulation can potentially help us to close a little bit, at least, the enforcement gap. Maybe one discussed points on corporate governance and on the role of corporates before either giving it back to you or going to banks, which is another very thorny area. If we think about the fundamental attributes of the corporate form, separate legal personality, limited liability, those are sort of things that every single country has in some way, shape, or form, right? They were universal sorts of responses to certain specific economic needs. What I think great scholarship has been acknowledging recently is that in the same way those are pretty universal, we have in different jurisdictions ways to try to curb abuses of the corporate form and to not allow limited liability to, in some kinds, insulates kind of risk that on the overall level, the net level, are making us all worse off. The UK, again, probably more than other jurisdictions, takes those traits really to the last consequences quite often. Different liability regimes for some for some kinds of claims might be a way around that as well. Should I tackle banking already, or should we?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a bunch of questions. Why don't you keep going with banking, and then we can go after.
So banking again, banking, and maybe focusing a bit on questions 3 and 4. Here we have plenty to say, right? If we think about the financial system generally, we see that banks generally, and that more specifically, are really lagging behind in terms of negatively affecting and financing sources of fossil fuel. The insurance industry, for instance, was more quickly to adapt in a sense because they're sort of facing an existential threat in some markets. You might have seen coverage for some things in California, coverage for some things in Australia are just not possible anymore. So they were very quick to try to lobby at the international level. Capital markets, Shell, BP, etc., they are getting very little money through issuance of equities lately. So that means the banks are really a very big focal point for trying to get things right. What's very sad to this story is that the UK was one of the first countries that came to grips with ultimately ignoring climate-related risks will really come and haunt us in the very near future. So Mark Carney, especially when he was governor of the Bank of England, chaired the Financial Stability Boards, mainstreamed discussions about climate-related risks into central banking. And then it basically went away. So I think the first thing that needs to happen at the moment is having a clear sense of what we expect out of, or what the government expects out of the central bank in terms of be it green finance, be it other things that central banks are doing, and who got the leads that the UK had at the moment were especially the central banks of France and the Netherlands with the Network for Greening the Financial System, which they're doing a good job in advancing some discussions, but not usually the central banks that were leading discussions at the international level in the first place. So first thing is basically having an agenda, and I'm not sure we have the agenda in the UK at the moment. I think thinking about commercial banks specifically, and I think again the data that you mentioned is pretty stark and a pretty accurate representation of where things stand. Here again, even if we're taking a pretty conservative approach, we have a situation nowadays where basically banks' balance sheets either don't reflect or might incentivize investments in fossil fuels. So investing, there's a bunch of capital requirements. If you're running a bank or you're trying to figure out risks in speaking in very broad terms, and usually investing in companies that have, earnings that are very predictable, that are safe assets by the current measures of what a safe asset might be, means that investing in something as Shell is incentivized because it has sort of those, in those very old accounting metrics, is a good investment. And a good chunk of what someone like Carney did and the NGFS has been doing is saying we need to bring climate-related risks, physical risks, transition risks, to banks' balance sheets. and potentially use other bits of regulation like capital requirements, basically saying how risky or non-risky an asset might be because of certain traits, to impact ultimately the cost of lending in some of those instances. So that would be bringing basically the risks into the accounts, into the balance sheets would already be a great thing. But the catch and my last point, I think, for this first part of the debate is the financial system is awfully dynamic in the best and worst ways possible, right? So if you don't make the correct set of movements at the correct time, money might just go to different places, right? To give you one example, we're seeing more and more lending through non-banking financial institutions. So things that look like banks, act like banks, but are not regulated like banks. We had that before the great financial crisis. We are seeing again an increase in that kind of capital as well. So you might have some substitutability there, for instance. So just sort of focusing on banks and even focusing on the systemically relevant banks, great thing, definitely a necessary step we need to do. But without other pieces of the puzzle, like taxonomies, like transition plans, like the director's duties, we might just see money flowing to different parts of the system or flowing to different countries as well. And I know we don't want to think about the election in the US next week, but that is going to change probably quite drastically a number of things.
Great. Thank you very much, Pedro. If I could just ask a few follow-ups, and then we'll go to everyone here for questions. On directors' duties, one of the things that you mentioned is public enforcement, which is very interesting. So private enforcement is quite weak. You mentioned the crime and Shell case, and I think that it was actually that they didn't even get off the very beginning because the court said that they didn't have good faith withstanding. For those of you who haven't heard of it, Client Earth is a sort of activist, sort of quasi-law firm, and it had a few shares in Shell, and so it tried to bring a derivative claim, and the court basically said, well, you're not doing this for the interests of members, you're doing it because you're an activist law firm, and it's not about improving Shell. And I think that their claim was breach of the duty of care, is that right?
172 and 174.
172 together.
So exactly.
Yeah, and saying that they need to cut their emissions in line with international standards. And the court just said, well, you don't even know. So, you know, we could have that conversation about like what we need to do to reform directors' duties and enforcement, but then you point to public enforcement as well. And it just reminded me of competition law, because they had this debate, well, I suppose it was about 10, 20 years ago now, of making sure that public and private enforcement work. And of course, there you didn't have any private enforcement, and it was introduced. And in company law, it's the other way around. Got very little private enforcement, even less public enforcement. So what might you envisage around public enforcement?
I think if we look around the world, we basically have different models, right? I'm not saying any one of those specifically might be a good fit for the UK, but again, the complementarity between private and public enforcement can be quite interesting, and quite often you're potentially opening it up to certain sectors of the economy, or for the representation of certain stakeholders, for instance. So in a good chunk, I think, if we think about securities regulation, if we think about securities regulators, generally speaking, quite a few of them, or public prosecutors, might have standing on public enforcement of securities law in quite a different few systems.
Including directors' duties.
Including in relation to the director's duties, and including eventual claims or torts related to other issues that might affect stakeholders. And then if the public entity fails to act on that duty, quite often you have sort of a private enforcement mechanism that's more lenient than what we have in the UK. So your example with the pension funds exists in quite a few jurisdictions. So if the public authority fails to prosecute something, you're able to have that discussion potentially through an association, usually that is representative of a certain group of members in that specific country.
And if I may, I mean, it's an interesting idea because, like in the derivative claim, the essential reason the courts are giving for the client not having standing is, well, you're not really part of the company. And you know, what they're trying to do is enforce what is really amounting to a public duty. And so, you know, it's a very neat solution as well. You just give a public body like the Competition and Markets Authority an equivalent.
And to be honest, usually the reasoning for that, it comes back to, again, very orthodox reasons. A good chunk of the mandates of those authorities is, if you have a securities market, the quality of information is ultimately basically a public good. Investors will decide to invest or decide not to invest because of the quality of information that companies are putting out, for instance. So something like Shell's transition plan, you know, is a part of the pricing for Shell's securities, for instance. And if you don't have enough information, it sort of follows in those systems that you don't have adequate pricing in the first place, which opens up the way for enforcement.
Great. And then a second follow-up theme on banking is, yeah, I mean, so Mark Brown did a lot of work to mainstream the idea of climate risk. And I suppose we could introduce a new law that requires not just banks, but all companies to take account of climate-related risks. But why do that instead of simply going straight for what is needed, which is stopping the harmful activity? I mean, do you think that there's a role for both, or one is preferable to the other, or what?
It's a great question. I think, especially again in finance, we face sort of we face some problems that come down to basically the quality of finance today, how international, how interconnected, and how mobile it is. So sometimes just trying to go from 0 to 100 might mean relocating that capital elsewhere. Could be a different part of the same financial system in the same country. Could be you know, a different bank's headquarters in another country. If you look at some of the recent changes in the UK's financial regulators, the FCA gained, for instance, a competitiveness mandate. So it's grappling with how much I can do without losing capital to the EU, to the US, etc. The way around that, I think, is fair enough. You can try to push, and I think you have very good reasons to say no new lending to fossil fuel companies, for instance. Even again, adopting a pretty orthodox approach of regulation of corporate governance. You have been trying to focus on long term in corporate governance for years and years upon years. To be acting on something that's pretty, you know, orthodox for corporate governance. I think the more you're able to advance domestically on getting to those targets, the more you can eventually use some of the channels for international coordination to try to avoid some of that arbitrage, some of that competition via different countries. So it's focusing on the big banks is a good start. Not as easy to substitute their parts, but changing all at once might have negative effects, ironically enough.
Sure. Okay, great. Comments or questions from